ITV game last night, and there was an interview with Mark Bullingham, the CEO of the FA, and he was explaining how the 5 FIFA officials came into the hotel and explained that 2 hours pre them leaving, I think, for the first game against Iran. And obviously the FA have backed down. The FA have always been a risk-averse organisation. They've always been an organisation that, when it comes to it, will probably take the safe approach. Let's be really clear about that. That's been for 20, 30, 40 years. You've got people in positions there. I do like Debbie Hewitt, the new chair. I do think she actually, to be fair, has got great bravery. But to move an organisation like an oil tanker that the FA is, to start taking on FIFA, they're not in that. They don't still have that strength to be able to do that. You know, I think you'd have to ask the LGBTQ plus community about what they think about the rainbow, the arch being lit up as a rainbow. I think they'll still feel extremely disappointed. I think they'll feel like it's a token gesture. I think they'll feel like we didn't follow through with it. And I see, I've mentioned it a couple of times now, that we are expecting a lot from football players, and I think that's a good thing. I expect a lot from ex-football players. We're expecting high standards from football players and ex-football players, and we've seen over the last few years how Marcus Rashford and Raheem Sterling have, I think, changed the dynamic of conversation around political intervention from football players, but also social injustice as well. And I think that's really important that happens, and I think it's the same with ourselves. But I think within this tournament now, we're now looking at football players to take the fight to regions of the world on massive issues that exist not just all over in this region, but in Africa, in parts of the Far East. And we know that it's illegal to be gay in 8 countries that are playing in this World Cup, yet they're still playing in this World Cup. We know that basically we have massive embedded relationships as the UK with this region, on arms, on armed services, on banking sector, in banking sector and finance, in obviously institutions in our country, on energy, all these massive political relationships. Our royal family have relationships with the Middle East, on horse racing. We have F1 over here, we have tennis over here, we have golf over here. But football apparently is the one that has to deal with all these issues, and we're asking football players to put themselves, in some pretty difficult positions at times. But if you do say you're going to do something, which is what we have done and what England have done, you have to follow through with it. The best thing would be to have done is not to commit to it until you knew that you couldn't do it to start with, if they weren't going to follow through with it. So I think the LGBTQ plus community will be disappointed, but there is a wider conversation to be had on these things about the role of football and the role of football players, the role of ex-football players. I'm really interested in it. I'm really interested in it because I've been criticised heavily coming into this tournament, and I actually welcome that criticism. But I'd like to know why it's not okay for Gary Neville to speak for a whole broadcaster over here, but we're allowed to sell arms to this country. We're allowed to have our armed services over here protecting the borders. We're allowed to buy 40% of our energy. Our royal family are allowed to have horses at Ascot and Goodwood. I'm interested to know why these relationships with our political parties with donations are okay, why they're allowed to own our banks like Barclays Bank and London Heathrow Airport and London Stock Exchange. I'm interested to know why all these relationships can happen with the Middle East. But me, who've been coming over here for 20 years to this country, who have fantastic friends, I have sporting and commercial relationships in this country, I want to understand why people think it's hypocritical of me to have relationships with partners over here, but it's not for the rest of the UK sort of economy and the rest of the UK sort of networks. And football players like Harry Kane at this moment in time are in the spotlight, and they're the ones that are being stood up to account, held to account for not wearing an armband. But I think it's a wider conversation for how the UK in general approaches the Middle East. Should there be a World Cup in the Middle East? There absolutely should be. Should there be a World Cup in Africa? There absolutely should be. Should there be a World Cup in the USA in 4 years' time, where we've got gun laws that we abhor, that we've got basically we've got women's rights issues around abortion, we've got capital punishment that still exists in states. And I deplore and detest working practices and some of the cultural and religious beliefs that exist in parts of the world that I have been to. But it was football that took me to these places. Manchester United in England brought me to the Middle East, they brought me to the Far East, they brought me to Africa. They've told me all my life to enjoy them and to have good relationships in these countries where the Premier League sell their commercial rights to the same broadcaster that I'm working for, and that's okay. Where Manchester United and other great clubs in our country have commercial relationships all over the world, in parts of the world where it's illegal to be gay, where working practices are abhorrent. And we can say that, but still, from a position of having partnerships with them, but still highlight them. And we're highlighting them as football players. Football players are the ones who are standing up, who are willing to be actually held to account. But I don't see anybody else. I don't see our politicians over here talking about these issues. I don't see our F1 drivers. I don't see our tennis players, our golfers. I don't see our politicians. I don't see our energy sectors and bankers and all the people who are working in those sectors with massive billion-pound contracts in place doing the things are being held to account in the same way that football players are. And I think it's time that football players push back a little bit. You know, Harry wanted to wear that armband. He maybe should have worn that armband and probably should have followed through with it. But you're not saying Harry Kane doesn't want to support the LGBTQ plus community. You don't think Harry Kane doesn't believe in workers' rights, doesn't believe in women's rights? Of course he does. But he's there being dragged from pillar to post by the FIFA, by the FA, by his own position and the players that he's playing with and the sporting consequence. And it's not an easy thing for a football player. We're from low-income, working-class backgrounds, football players. Yet people from backgrounds of wealth, which all those other sectors that I've mentioned are, they seem to get off scot-free. Yeah. And I think it's time footballers did push back a little bit. We've got a situation where Raheem Sterling 4 years ago made an incredibly brave and courageous statement around racism, whilst party leaders in our country were making statements that were, to be fair, divisive and non-inclusive and discriminatory. You know, so my point is, it's football players. You know, the early parts of the pandemic, the health minister, Matt Hancock, who's currently on television in the jungle, said that footballers need to do more at the start of a pandemic. This was a situation whereby it was an incredibly emotive situation. Everybody was nervous in the country, but Matt Hancock chose footballers to single out. Not any other sector in the country. Football players must do more. Now, I think football players feel that they should do more. We feel that we should be role models. But I think also we feel that other people at times should be held to account in the same way. And the reality of it is, at the moment, football players have been expected to do a lot and asked a lot of. And I get that, and I want that. I want there to be political intervention and impact through sport and football. But that means we have to be inclusive. Should there be a football tournament in the Middle East? Yes. I think if it had been perfectly handled many years ago, we would have had it across the region, not just in one country maybe, but it's here in Qatar. Should there be a World Cup in Africa? Should there be a World Cup in the Far East? Should there be World Cups in parts of the world where we don't agree with some of the practices that exist? There absolutely should be, because we need to make sure through football we have impact. And the reality of it is, we have it in our country whereby we've got football clubs that are owned by parts of the world which we don't agree with parts of what they do, but I'd rather be sat around the table and having that conversation and challenging it. I've done 2 documentaries on challenging workers' rights issues over here and challenging women's rights issues and highlighting the LGBTQ sort of laws over here and how it's illegal. I've been doing that for 4 or 5 years. I'm happy that I'm over here. There are politicians, members of the royal family, there are members of big business in our country who are saying they're not coming to this World Cup, whilst having billions of pounds of deals with this region and massive relationships with this region. Football players are the only people who are putting scrutiny on it. The reason that kafala system has gone in this country, which is the working practice where they remove passports and whereby people, you know, the employer owns the employee essentially, and they can't move jobs, is because of the scrutiny of football and Amnesty International and the Independent the International Labour Organisation, the ILO, coming over here and placing scrutiny on it. In other parts of the Middle East where there hasn't been that scrutiny, they still have the kafala system. So football does create change. There has been change in Qatar that's been positive through football, through the World Cup. Now, it's not gone far enough, but I would like to think that this is a journey whereby fully one day we can get there, and ultimately that's where, you know, England had the World Cup in 1966, it was illegal to be gay, and we've gone on an incredible journey on LGBTQ plus and gay rights in this last 60, 70 years, and that's what we should be doing. But this country needs to be on that same journey, and will be on that same journey hopefully, and maybe football's played a big part in that, because I'm not sure the other sector